Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're joined by Jimmy Mesta. Jimmy, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris and Nikki. Good to be here.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to chat with you on all things Kubernetes security and compliance. But, before we dive into that, for folks that don't know you, maybe haven't come across your work or anything like that, do you mind telling us a bit about your background?
Cool. Yeah. My name is Jimmy, and I'm currently the co-founder and CTO of a company called KSOC. So hence the Kubernetes theme for today. I've been working in application and infrastructure security for about 15 years. And about 5.5 years ago, I went down a Kubernetes rabbit hole that I haven't seemed to have escaped yet. So here we are today, still chatting about it. And good to be here.
Yeah, definitely. So before we get down the rabbit hole of Kubernetes, which never seems to end, for folks that don't know what Kubernetes is, maybe they're not too familiar with it. What is it exactly, and what's the buzz about Kubernetes?
There is a buzz. Seems like it's only increasing. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration platform, kind of classically. If you go to kubernetes.io, it's a lot more than that. It's kind of this ecosystem and community that's built a new way to deploy infrastructure using containers, amongst other things. So it's really enabled developers to kind of push products faster, iterate quicker, and it's also introduced some security challenges. So that's kind of why we're here today, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to ask, we know it has many benefits, obviously, orchestrating containers and efficiency and, immutability and all those good things. But from a security perspective, what are some key things that folks should keep in mind as they start to go on that journey of adopting Kubernetes?
Yeah, funny you should ask. I recently, as you had in your LinkedIn post, recently been working on an OWASP top 10 for Kubernetes. The world... having more top 10s doesn't hurt. Kubernetes in and of itself has gained so much adoption that it's good for security teams to have that sort of one-stop shop, that reference documentation that gives you a place to go to learn more. I would defer to that for a lot of it. We can pick it apart during this show as well if you'd like. But really, number one, at least in my eyes, this is not everybody's opinion necessarily, is still misconfiguration. That's the name of the game in cloud security, and Kubernetes is no different. So, we often like to describe Kubernetes as a platform. It's kind of like a data center inside of your data center. So there's networking, secrets management. There's even, system level calls at the kernel that you have to be worried about, allowing or disallowing. There's access control. All of those things kind of bubble up in this highly abstracted thing that we call Kubernetes. And I think that's the challenge of, the next few years in security is how do we wrangle that at scale?
Well, it actually blends perfectly into my next question for you, because on the security side, I've seen just how easy it is to misconfigure Kubernetes. I mean, anything really, but very specifically Kubernetes. And I'm curious about specifically when it comes to RBAC, thinking about identity access management, but specifically role-based access controls. What do you think that plays into Kubernetes? Because I really haven't heard a lot of people talk about this, about sort of the implications here or what's important to know. So could you give us a little bit about sort of what RBAC means to Kubernetes?
Yeah, I'd love to. So role-based access control is not a new concept, right? We have this applied in lots of different areas of security. Where things get really interesting is the actual implementation of RBAC inside of a cluster. So RBAC in Kubernetes is a combination of roles, cluster roles, role bindings, and cluster role bindings. You take subjects or groups and kind of pick and choose your own adventure on who gets access to what. And really, it comes down to the Kubernetes API. So the API itself is responsible for authentication, right? That's one layer, and that's actually part of the top 10 authorization and admission control. And RBAC is that kind of off Z step. So as operators, it's up to us to either grant or deny access to humans or service accounts to the API itself. And you have to remember that the Kubernetes API is everything's driven through it. So if you want to create a pod, list secrets, delete something, roll out a new version of a stateful set, that's all managed by the Kubernetes API. So the access control that RBAC grants is really important. And if you look at the number of objects available within a cluster in whatever version, 122, 123, it's a lot. And you have to pick and choose your RBAC policies with their associated verbs, get, list, patch, post, kind of the HTTP verbs, and come up with something that works for you, that doesn't give too much permission, but also lets the person or entity do what they need to do. So that's like the high level problem with RBAC. I think a lot of cloud vendors, I mean, there's a lot of tools out there to help you with IAM in like GCP, AWS, Azure. I think most of them stop at the Kubernetes API because RBAC is kind of a messier thing to deal with. So that's the problem statement. How we address it, it's not easy, right? Because today there's rarely one cluster, right? You're typically going into an environment that has 5, 10, 50, maybe even 100 clusters. The next generation of problems will literally be, how do you make sure that Jimmy has access to the right things in these subset of clusters, but not these other things in these clusters? And that becomes, I mean, everything's a YAML problem at the end of the day in Kubernetes, but it becomes a big one, right? So yeah, that's the high level. I'm happy to dive in. There's a whole, I think I put it, yeah, we have it at number 3 at the top 10. And maybe you could argue it could be higher. I don't know. Like there's a couple examples there. One is like giving a default service account that's mounted into pods in a given namespace cluster admin, right? It's like, I don't know, 10 lines of YAML, but if you come across it, it's actually really dangerous. And I think that's the kind of nuance that is going to cause some problems in the future, and already has.
Yeah, you're describing, kind of the fundamental security concepts of least permissive access control, and is very fundamental to zero trust that we're seeing, folks trying to push for too. One question I had for you real quick before I ask another one is actually like, we're talking about how everything is declarative, it's written in S code and YAML, that kind of thing. And you mentioned misconfigurations are arguably the top concern in cloud, which I agree with you. And the data shows that that's the case as well. Most cloud security breaches are traced to misconfigurations by the customer. Are there any tools or recommendations you have in terms of, since you're doing a declarative approach, how do you catch these things earlier in the life cycle before runtime? How do you, run some checks, do some linting, those kind of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one that we grapple with at KSOC every day. Like, because you can realistically enforce security control as far as like a pre-commit hook on the developer laptop, and then all the way into almost like a kernel observability state, right? Of like what's happening in the cluster and everything in between. So what's really nice about Kubernetes, it comes with this nice feature called admission controllers. And what they do is actually act as a gating mechanism. There's authentication, authorization via RBAC, and then admission control can either allow or deny a given entity from entering a cluster, or mutate it, if you will. So admission control, historically from the security context, has been used in this feature called pod security policies, which is now deprecated, but the concept is still really powerful. That's a great place to find things. Some may say it's not early enough. You probably want a layered approach where you're doing static analysis as well as part of CI. There's tools out there like Chekhov, and even running, Open Policy Agent and Rego. Like you can point those things at as more of like a GitHub action style implementation. Those are really helpful for like the quick hit where you check something into Git and all of a sudden you're like, whoops, that's privileged and it shouldn't be, right? And you get the instant feedback as part of CI. But admission control is still part of the equation because it's that pre-flight check where you can have different policies for different types of configurations right before things are scheduled to be run in the cluster. So the open source kind of classic is Open Policy Agent's Gatekeeper project. So Gatekeeper is going to act as an admission control sort of functionality where you can distribute different Rego policies to different clusters and say, I allow these things over here, but not over here. It also offers the ability to scan your current runtime configuration state and give you a report back to kind of go on a firefighting quest, right? To try to figure out what's actually broken so you could fix it. And then I still think you need runtime. Like there's a bunch of ways to get past CI these days. You could just kube control straight into a cluster. You never talk to your build process. You could have some legacy workloads that have been there before your security tools are there. So all three steps are necessary. And really the name of the game is like, it's almost governance at that point where you're trying to distribute these policies and have visibility across multiple clusters. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And it makes sense. Nikki has a question soon here on governance. So that's perfect. Real quick, before we got to that, I did want to mention another alternative project I'm working on is using Kyverno as the admission controller. So we've had some good luck with that so far in implementing, whether it's mutating webhooks or just, auditing policies, things like that. But nonetheless, I want to ask
Kubewarden too, I guess we should throw out there as another alternative. It utilizes WASM, I believe, to kind of do policy checks. Kyverno is great, especially if you're just using it in Kubernetes. It's the best choice, right? Because it has all the bells and whistles you'd expect inside of the cluster.
Yeah, definitely. I'll have to check out the other one you mentioned. I hadn't heard of it yet, so I'll have to dig into that. I wanted to ask you too. You mentioned a little bit about EKS from AWS or Azure Kubernetes Service from Azure. Any thoughts around people that are deciding to roll their own, as they call it, do Kubernetes from scratch themselves versus use a managed Kubernetes offering from a cloud service provider? Any do's and don'ts or recommendations? I mean, me personally, I think the managed service offerings tend to be work out a little better, especially at scale. But I'm curious your perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people tend to just kind of say, why would you ever build your own Kubernetes cluster? Because we do have a really nice managed offering in all clouds, even the smaller ones, right? Like Linode has one, DigitalOcean has a Kubernetes offering. So it is hard to recommend building your own the hard way, as Kelsey Hightower would put it, right? But it actually is more common than I think I even realized. There's still a lot of on-prem bare metal clusters. If you're doing like IoT things, there's Kubernetes on cruise ships. Like we're using Kubernetes in very odd ways. So sometimes you have to build your own. The gotcha when you're not using managed Kubernetes, and your audience may know this, but like you control the components that get spun up, right? The kubelet, the CA infrastructure, the Kubernetes API, the nodes, right? You choose the OS, you choose how to maintain security and patching and hardening. So all of a sudden you don't have a button that is sitting in your browser that says like upgrade, right? You're kind of in this situation where you have these different flags that you may not even know the implication of that you can turn off or on the Kubernetes API that could really like put you in a bad spot. So I would say there is still a very strong pull towards building your own Kubernetes, and there will be for a while because people want that control, but it's going to be more work than you'd think. Managed Kubernetes abstracts not everything, but at least the core infrastructure. They're giving you the guardrails to be successful from a security standpoint. You can still mess things up, but you're not going to be on your own. So that's the warning that everyone should heed. So if you're a startup like today building a company and you just need a compute environment, like you should probably use managed Kubernetes, right? But if you're mature, have a colo, then even EKS Anywhere, these types of things are starting to see the need for more on-prem bare metal implementation. So I think it's doable. You have to have the expertise to maintain it.
Yeah, I saw there was actually a comment in the chat about the benefit of control versus the cost of management, and I think it's dead on, because if you leave management like patch management, vulnerability management, things like that up to your system owners or the people that are actually administering the environment, then it's a little bit more prone to potentially vulnerabilities, things like that. Whereas having a managed environment can cut down on a lot of the administrative overhead, which is, always a benefit. So to take us back to governance, because this is something that I think is a really interesting topic. And again, something that I really haven't heard a lot around, specifically Kubernetes or large scale multi-cluster environments. So could you give us a little bit about how you feel about sort of where governance is at? Where do we need more governance, less governance? Where do you think we're at right now?
Yeah, I mean, governance is a bit of a overloaded term, even in our lovely security industry. But when I think of governance in the world of Kubernetes, it's how do we take the operating procedures and policies that our company has put forth, right? There's certain risks we're willing to take, some we're not, and there's controls around those, and we've kind of figured this out in regulated industries in the past through compliance controls. We have lots of frameworks to help us. We have internal, kind of GRC teams even. And I think Kubernetes just introduces that additional layer of complexity that makes governance a little hard, because all of a sudden you've taken what may have seemed like a kind of battle hardened SDLC, where you deploying things on hardened servers, they follow CIS. There's a very clear separation of duties, right? The separation of duties story, even alone in Kubernetes, is pretty bad. I don't like, it's not bad, but it's very much like that cluster is responsible for a lot of different things, and humans still access the cluster, and so do service accounts. So I think governance for me is really how do you take this developer friendly solution that's really configurable and apply the guardrails needed to conform with your organization standards that you set forth even before you implemented Kubernetes. Again, it comes down to policy, right? Act like control over where different workloads are going, how configurations get distributed, how do you detect anomalies? And we're still, I mean, I feel like we're still pretty early days in doing that sort of thing. I mean, I'll admit I'm trying to build a company around concepts like that, but it's not the norm to have a multi-cluster heterogeneous sort of environment that's totally locked down. And, it's very rare to see a security team that just feels good about their Kubernetes security story today. So that's my thought on governance. And I hope to see a day where the clusters themselves are kind of like even more ephemeral, like they are part of these different groups. They have different levels of control based off of the data that's stored in them and the applications that are processing that data, the developers that have access to it. And, the security teams can treat them almost as its own VM or operating system, but we're still pretty far away from that.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment before I turn it back to Chris for his next question, but I think it is one of those push-pull things that we're starting to see with environments like Kubernetes, right? It's a very different way of operating than you would like an on-prem data center, or even just, in a cloud environment with VMs. So I kind of agree. And I feel like there's sort of this need to adapt what we currently have to say, okay, does this make sense in a massive Kubernetes environment, or does it not? Do we have mitigating controls or mitigating circumstances in play that may not be, directly correlated to some specific control, but maybe just as viable and easier to manage? So I think it's definitely an important point.
Yeah, it's almost we've swapped like RFID key cards in the data center with some mashup of cloud IAM mixed with Kubernetes RBAC, and that's pretty hard to like have a comparison to. So I think it's going to be challenging, right? Like even just access alone, what we've seen is you go into an environment, the ideal state is like, yeah, nobody should be accessing these clusters. Humans don't need to do it. And you actually talk to the people running Kubernetes, and it's like, well, this team needed it over here. There's some cluster admin over here. And, we're not, like, we have the logs, they're in S3, and like the story gets very kind of weak as you crack open how people are using Kubernetes. There's like the ideal theoretical, but then the real world's super messy.
Yeah. I'm just laughing on mute as you were saying that, because it sounds so similar to my experiences in different environments. It's how it should be versus, well, we have to fix it. We have to clean that up a little. And, that's often the case.
It's on the roadmap. Everything's on the roadmap. Yeah.
I wanted to ask too, you talked about compliance, and I know we have like a CIS benchmark. We have even a DISA STIG from DoD now, when it comes to Kubernetes, for example. Any comments around compliance in Kubernetes? And also, this is kind of a workforce question in my mind too, because in my experience, the auditing folks, struggle sometimes to keep up with technology around cloud and Kubernetes. So just trying to help them understand how these new technological paradigms and environments work has been a challenge for me, depending on the teams and environments that I'm working with.
Yeah, well, I mean, a story of so my first Kubernetes production experience was at 0.8. I was in charge of compliance and security, and amongst other things, but we had to deal with PCI, and we brought a cluster, and this is a long time ago. We had to bring a cluster into scope for PCI before the PCI auditors could pronounce Kubernetes, right? It was very much like, what is this? And we were installing, like, for the theatrics of it, I guess we could talk about now, like Clam AV on the nodes inside of a Kubernetes cluster. And you're like, that's not how this works. But they were trying to just like reach for something, right? It's like, well, you need antivirus on your operating systems. And it's like, I don't think, these are containers, but anyways, so we put it on there. So we've come further, I think. I'll admit I haven't been deep in like the actual compliance, like game with auditors in very recent history, but I still think there's a massive disconnect. And all we have are, you're right, like CIS, NSA hardening guidelines. There's some, the DoD projects around like hardened containers. There's really nothing inside of like PCI itself. We'll take, for example, that says like Kubernetes needs to behave this way. I think that's going to change pretty soon. There has to be a reckoning where like these auditors go on site and they're interacting with Kubernetes. They have to be, and they're being pulled in scope. So, I think that's like why I wanted to make the top 10 project too. It's like, it's not a compliance piece, but it's at least some sort of reference architecture to kind of help guide the conversation. But we're still in a state of confusion when it comes to pure compliance, I think. So I've heard like murmurs of things happening in the compliance world in Kubernetes and containers. So you might know more than me, but I think it's only the natural progression. So.
Yeah, and I want to loop back a little bit talking about assessments and audits and things like that, but also just from a pure administration of Kubernetes. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of API logs? Like why do we need them, and maybe why they should be enabled and maybe monitored in some way?
Yeah. This is another top 10 thing. It's the Kubernetes API itself provides a generous log output that's there for the taking, right? It gives you a ton of detailed information on who's doing what and what, like, verb they're using, whether it was allowed or denied in the actual RBAC that's implemented in that cluster. And people don't use it really. They kind of just put it into a bucket somewhere and maybe can call upon it during an incident or something like that. So those API audit logs, if you're using managed Kubernetes, you're probably already storing them and you didn't even know. That's kind of part of the offering. They get pushed to Stackdriver and GCP. Azure has its thing. And like, you're starting to see the cloud providers have, like, in Azure and Sentinel, things like that. You can actually do some detections with these logs. But they they should be used in your SIEM, right? They should be used as part of your security story. This is as important as your kind of CloudTrail, CloudWatch logging infrastructure. And there's interesting information there, right? You can see things like, hey, Nikki was trying to list secrets in the Cube system namespace at midnight last night from an IP address that she's never come from before. And she did it 10 times and was denied. And like, that's a high signal, right? Like that's a very like, okay, something's wrong. So yeah, we should use them, store them, and take them to other tools. Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of that. There's other logs too, right? Like you actually have like CloudTrail specific logs to EKS. There's logs that are generated from like standard out, standard error inside your applications. That's a little different. But at least start by cracking open the Kubernetes audit log and seeing what you can come up with. There's a really great blog, two-part blog post by the folks at Square that I'll pull it up. It's called Threat Hunting with Kubernetes API Audit Logs. I'll throw it in the private chat and you can do with it what you will. But it just gives you like this example of like taking these logs, throwing them into like an Elasticsearch, using Kibana, having some pretty basic instrumentation around it and some kind of panes of glass to see what's going on. Like you're going to learn a lot pretty quickly. So
yeah, I just quick note on that. It's really how I feel about PowerShell logging. It's the same thing. It's like people don't see, they may not have it configured properly, or if they do have it configured, they're not actually monitoring it or have any sort of alerting on it. It's one of those services that you really want to be monitoring. Like it's the same situation. If somebody's trying to run some elevated PowerShell script in Active Directory at midnight on a Saturday night, you're kind of like, I wonder why that's happening. So I think it's just an important note. It's like all this logging is available. And creating like actionable alerts on things, like you can tailor it enough that you're getting really good information. So I just thought it was a great point.
Yeah. Well, and you can take those logs and start having a least privilege story, right? Because you know the RBAC policy and like GCP, my friend last week pointed this out to me. If you go into the GCP console and check out the IAM, it's like in the IAM tab, they have this like little button that you wouldn't really see. That's just like analyze access or something. And it gives you this like amazing rundown of the last 90 days of like what I did associated to this particular IAM role that I'm in GCP. And it says like remove extra access. Like it's so easy. And like we don't really have that in Kubernetes today, where everything's just like too much permission. But these logs can help you get to least permissive, as you said, Chris, sort of a standpoint, which is really good.
Yeah, I think those native services that let you, we always talk about establishing a baseline, right? And then, looking for anomalous behavior, those logs or those native services, I should say, help you right size those permissions in a pretty creative and unique way. So it's really awesome. I wanted to ask you too, like, you mentioned this OWASP Kubernetes Top 10 project that you have. How did that come about and how has the experience been, creating that so far? I think everyone's familiar with like OWASP Top 10 in some way or shape or form of other projects outside of Kubernetes. So I'm curious how that came about and how it's been so far.
Yeah. So I've been in and around OWASP for much of my security career. And it's a good organization. Like there's a solid group of folks that are out there trying to push application security, at least historically. Today, it's a little different. You'd be surprised at the content if you really start digging into the OWASP projects that are out there. There's a bunch of stuff that's infra related. There's a ton of things that are going to help you with compliance. And it's really not just an application security sort of organization anymore. So the impetus was, I just think like, I think in top 10 sometimes where like, especially you have these high level conversations with security leaders where you're like, just give me the things that I can do today to start working on, because I don't know what I don't know, right? You hear that a lot in Kubernetes, especially where you're like, where do I start? And I think a top 10 project makes a lot of sense for such a complicated ecosystem. There is an OWASP Kubernetes security cheat sheet. That is something I worked on with a few folks last year, and it's a much more detailed, kind of in the weeds of like what to find, what to fix, where the problems are. So it kind of made sense to spearhead a top 10. I started it a while ago, I'll admit, and it just took everything in me to just like bust it out. And now we're in the like review feedback phase, which is awesome. Like, because people can come and say like, I disagree with this rank order, or let's add some more color over here. And, I actually last night did I was at the OWASP Northern Virginia chapter meetup virtually and presented like the actual kind of top 10 with slides and stuff. And I think, it's a good start. There's a lot more to do. It's just kind of me typing a lot of words, but I hope that changes and people can come and add their thoughts. And this is, I'll put a link to, there's 3 links in this post of last night's presentation, the slides in the repo. So
okay, I'll drop those in the comments. I will say, cool. I shared it last night, via LinkedIn in advance of the show, and it was super well received. And I can relate to thinking in lists. Like, it's very, security is complex. We have a lot of things to focus on, and just having like a list helps me orient myself to like, what are the primary things I need to try to at least get my head around first.
Yeah, we should be thinking in graphs, but we got to start somewhere. It's probably good to have a list, and that's what I found, at least. So it helps me frame a lot of conversations, and it should help others, I hope.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's absolutely helpful. And OWASP, I feel like in general, it's one of those things I reference all the time. It's such a helpful, well-organized format for me to go have conversations with people who maybe aren't as technical, or give them a resource that's like, hey, this is a great place to start, right? If you're just sort of getting started, it's a great place to start. So yes, definitely helpful. I did want to ask you your thoughts, being, so sort of like involved in this with Kubernetes and clusters. Where do you think, in a couple of directions, where do you think the future of Kubernetes is, as far as security, as far as compliance? And I'm curious about this from the perspective of, Kubernetes. I think unless you're sort of really engrossed with it and using it all the time, especially as a security practitioner, you have to learn a lot. You sort of really have to get hands-on with it and understand it. So can you talk a little bit about where the future you think is going, and especially around security?
Yeah, I think I have my ideas, and I will plug there are three certificates that are, kind of courses and actual like certificates that you can pursue to level up your kind of Kubernetes domain expertise. The CKA, Certified Kubernetes Administrator, CKAD, Certified Kubernetes Application Developer, and then CKS. There's a security one, but I don't know. Is that it? CKS? Yeah. Those are great because they're not I won't get into other security certifications, but they're actually really good. The experience is worthwhile. So if you want to level up as a security practitioner, CKA, CKAD, all these things are going to help you a ton. I like to I think it was like Joe Beta, one of the first Kubernetes kind of at Google creators. I think he had a tweet forever ago that was like, we've hit a point in Kubernetes that like the net new exciting features, they aren't happening as much. We're building on top of it more, right? We're using this platform to bring in other styles of, GitOps or other tooling. Like the things we're doing with Kubernetes is now the exciting part, not the core releases. Back in 1.0 times, it was like, cool, RBAC came out today. Like we can actually like do stuff in this cluster and not be just administrators. The releases were insane. Today they're not quite like that. So what you end up seeing instead of these big releases that have a bunch of features is like people are doing cool things with Kubernetes. I was talking to a guy that he worked in some unnamed government entity that used Kubernetes clusters to deploy surveillance in war zones. Like they would have each node was like a rock or a fake bush or something, and they had sensors on them, and like the nodes were like locked down and like crazy stuff with Kubernetes. I've done assessments for emergency call centers that route calls through Kubernetes. Like that's pretty cool. So I think the future is like bright, but from a security standpoint, what we're going to end up seeing is there's probably going to be a bit of a reckoning pretty here soon where people who have done this like skunkworks project internally at their company, that grew to like 12 clusters, and all of a sudden you don't know what's going on. You're really in this, like I said it before, like a firefighting mode where you're like, I got to learn quickly, and auditors are watching. Like people are, using this at a scale I didn't know about. So we're gonna have a little course correction probably, but then I think like the Kubernetes platform will become more stable. There will be more security features built in, and hopefully education increases. It already is. Like I've been doing Kubernetes security training for a long time, and like today is so different than even 2 years ago. It's really impressive. But I think we have a long stretch ahead of this being the compute platform of choice. So I think the future means more regulation, more compliance, more everything that we did in cloud like 8 years ago. Now we're going to try to do again in Kubernetes. So that's really all security is like doing the same thing every 10 years, basically reinvent it's the same problems: least privilege, like secrets management, networking, segmentation. Like this, you could take sub Kubernetes in this top 10 and like put cloud or data center, and most of that stuff applies. So more the same.
Yeah, you kind of pointed out like what I think about often is like once you've been in security for a while, the concepts are the same. It's just a new technological paradigm that you're applying them to is very often the case. And then I did want to say, like, I've taken many certifications, and I've taken a couple of the Kubernetes ones, CKAD and CKA. And I will say those are definitely different, as you said, without naming other certifications. But it's all hands-on. There's no multiple choice. It's all in the CLI and the YAML. So it's very stressful and challenging. But you have
intense.
You have to know what you're doing. You can't guess. There's no guessing. And I did want to give a plug real quick. They came out with KCNA, which is Kubernetes Cloud Native Associate Certification, which is a multiple choice exam that they came out with. Is a good primer, get your foot in the water of just understanding what Kubernetes is. And I think it's a good opportunity for like the auditing community who's not going to be in the CLI poking around doing stuff daily and administrating clusters. Maybe that's a good opportunity to just orient themselves with the technology.
Interesting. I've never even heard of it. That's awesome. Is it through the Linux Foundation?
Yeah, it's just like think of like AWS's Cloud Practitioner. It's kind of like that, like just scratching the surface, but good enough for like auditing to at least understand what is Kubernetes and how the hell does it work, so it's a good one to check out. So my last question for you is actually, you mentioned that you're a co-founder and CTO at KSOC. Can you tell us a bit about like what led to that journey and what you guys are focusing on and where folks can find out more about the organization and that kind of thing too?
Yeah. So as I mentioned briefly, I was doing, I had a few year stint. I guess I would be like the self-title. I was the Kubernetes security architect, but I was independently helping companies figure this thing out. Kind of like, the larger companies of the world who had these Kubernetes environments, security teams weren't quite leveled up on the implications of that. So I was doing that for a few years. And as you can imagine, patterns arise of like same kind of thing in, major company in Europe over here, US company here. And KSOC was kind of born about 3 years ago where, I was attempting to unify a lot of those controls, right? With just what we talked about, kind of centralized governance, being able to detect anomalies, having kind of standard templates for clusters, like really built for the security team to scale with the rest of the org as they kind of adopted Kubernetes. So KSOC is a SaaS platform. I mean, at the end of the day, to address those needs. And we try to, be low impact and fit in developer workflows. So, our whole goal is to not be another list of Jira tickets that gets often ignored. We work with, kind of GitOps paradigms, as well as ambition control, what we talked about before, to come up with, governance that you can apply to 100 clusters. That's kind of the premise of KSOC as a platform. I was at a company called Signal Sciences before this, as a director of security research there, and we it was a WAF, next gen WAF, but we learned a lot about how to do kind of detection management at scale, how to deal with multi-tenant SaaS in like a security world, and a few of us now work at KSOC, and we're building something I think is pretty special. So you can learn more by just sending me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter, or jimmy@ksoc.com. Happy to talk to anybody about it. So
awesome. Thank you. So that's going to take us to our last question, which we ask everybody, but I'm really interested in your perspective on this. What does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Oh man, I guess that's the name of this show, isn't it?
Yeah, we gotta ask. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I think, to me, it's actually having a place, and this is a very kind of like technical infra spin, because that's what we're talking about. But you should be able to run any sort of workload inside of a given environment without the fear of it escalating out to oblivion, right? And what I mean by that is, like, you assume breach. You assume that an application has a remote code execution vulnerability, or somebody has access to a thing they shouldn't. And your job to be resilient is to build systems that limit the scope of that impact, right? The blast radius, if you want to use buzzwords. But it's really, being resilient is actually dealing with messy legacy software that's riddled with problems in an elegant way that doesn't compromise your entire organization. So that was at least off the top of my head. So, but
I love it.
That's
perfect
kind of what
answer.
I think of. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for being with us today. I feel like I have so much more I need to research after talking with you today. I'm like, I need to get more involved in this. So, so thank you so much for your expertise. If you are not following Jimmy on LinkedIn, you really should, and reach out and ask all your Kubernetes questions. All right. So thank you so much for joining us this week, Jimmy. That'll take us out for this week, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.